remember well is when we have an unstressed syllable and then a stressed one.
Exactly right. That's right. Comprising one unstressed syllable and one stressed syllable. Exactly. So we could write it like this. This line, diagonal line slash, shows that it's a foot, okay, the contours of the foot. And then if we have a cross for the unstressed and um, a long dash for the stressed, so it's da-da, if you like, da-da, okay, a short sound followed by a long sound. And an iambic, that's an I am, okay, that's an I am. Right. Now, in your plaquette on the Amethyst page, at the back of the plaquette, you have um, three sort of documents about poetic form, including prosody. Okay, so you can look this up. But that's an I am. And what are the other main feet then that we use in English prosody? Can anybody remember? Hello. What's this one? When it's the reverse, and I am backwards. Anybody remember? And I am backwards is a trochee, right? And when we have a quite frequent form pattern is the trochaic inversion. Okay, it's when you have, instead of beginning the line with an I am, as is traditional, you begin with you begin with the trochee, da, 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 and then you get the I am. Yeah. Okay, so and the others, do you remember? There's the anapest, right? The anapest and the dactyl and the spondy and the pyrrhic. Okay, so the anapest, which is a foot with three syllables, da da da, two unstressed and one stressed. The dactyl, which is three syllables, one stressed, two unstressed. The spondy, which is two stressed, and the pyrrhic, which is two unstressed. Okay, so you've got information on that in your Amethyst, on the document on your Amethyst page. All right. So then, what's a pentameter? We've said iambic. What's a pentameter?
It's 10 syllable.
Well, okay, a 10-syllable line would, strictly speaking, would be a decasyllabic, right?
Mm-hmm.
A pentameter usually does have 10 syllables too, but it can have 9, it can have 11, and it's actually a sort of compromise, a fusion between a syllabic line and a stress-based line. It's what we call accentual syllabic. Okay, English poetry, the basic prosody of English poetry, the basic line is accentual syllabic, and that means it's a kind of compromise of two traditions. And yes, you're right, 5 feet, 5 iams. It has 5. It is strictly, I mean, the basic iambic pentameter is a line which looks like this. If we just write it out, it looks like this. Oh, just let somebody else in. How many have we got? 3, 4. Okay, that's what it looks like. Da 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 da. And obviously, you can tell that if all the iambic pentameters are regular, the effect will be, musically speaking, rhythmically speaking, very boring. which is why you get all sorts of variations. Now we'll come perhaps back to that in a sec, but otherwise I'll get confused. But just to go back to what I'll talk to you more about the accentual syllabic in a minute, but what are the two basic kinds of sonnet in English poetry? Can somebody tell me the names of the two kinds of English sonnet? There are two basic structures, two forms. And just as the accentual syllabic is a compromise, is a fusion between two traditions, these two traditions are reflected also in these two structures. Can anybody tell me the names of the two kinds of sonnet? No? Well, the Petrarchan sonnet, or Italian, and the Shakespearean sonnet. All right. Does that not ring a bell? Can anybody tell me how they are structured? What the difference in structure is between these two sonnets? The continental one, the Italian continental sonnet, and the homegrown Shakespearean sonnet. Okay. Well, the Shakespearean one, well, let's start with the Petrarchan one was the earliest. That's the sonnet arrived in England in the English court, in the Elizabethan court. It was from Italy, presumably through translation, and it's composed of an octave, that is to say, an 8-line stanza, and a sestet, okay, a 6-line stanza. All right, an octave and a sestet. Okay, so that means you've in fact got a structure which has an imbalance in it. And I think I've put the quotation down here from John Fuller in his preface to his Oxford book of sonnets, which is this book here, the Oxford Book of Sonnets, which is now on your Amity's page. Okay, I just put it there. So he says that the Petrarchan sonnet has a satisfying imbalance of structure, and that's because when you have a stanza of 8, whatever size stanza you have, it creates an expectation for another stanza of the same size. So when you have the octave, you expect another octave, and actually you get a sestet. So that creates a sort of sense of imbalance, which he says is a satisfying imbalance of structure. He says it's like an acorn in its cup. Quoting, I can't remember who, says it's like an acorn in its cup. It's to say that it's an organic form. Okay, it has an organic structure. It feels as though it's what we mean by organic is a poetic form that seems the perfect shape for its content. It's when the content and the container seem to grow together, when the ideas expressed seem to fall into the form of the poem that they take. If you compare that idea with the idea of taking a poetic form, and if you say, right, I'm going to write a sonnet, okay, if you sit there, I'm going to write a sonnet, then you're taking a received form and you're sort of filling that received form. But if you manage to write in such a way as to completely give the sense that it's that the form and the ideas have grown together, then that John Fuller says is what the Petrarchan sonnet achieves. And it's been described also, and if you read the preface, you'll see that as the advance and retreat of the tide, another sort of natural image to convey the naturalness of the Petrarchan sonnet. And this you can compare. Oh, sorry, I've got this word volta here. There is a volta in the sort of separating the two parts. So a volta means a turning point, a slight change of direction. So it's a poem in two parts. The Shakespearean sonnet, this one, divides into 3 quatrains and a couplet. Okay, I'm sure you've seen many examples of those over the past few weeks, and just to quote a poet quoted by John Fuller in his preface, to convey the idea that by contrast with the Petrarchan sonnet, the Shakespearean has this couplet at the end, which seems to provide a much sort of stronger closure, sense of ending, a stronger sort of sense of ending, a clear cut ending, a closed, clear-cut ending. And William Bell Scott says, "Then when the heart can wish no more, with a strong couplet bars the door." Okay, you've got that quotation here. "Then when the heart can wish no more, with a strong couplet bars the door." Okay, so that's something to bear in mind when writing about sonnets. Now, this sort of hybridity in the sonnet, on the one hand, the continental Petrarchan, and on the other, the homegrown sonnet, this can be seen in the verse. Okay, in this line, accentual syllabic. Okay, the syllabic part refers to the continental tradition, and the accentual refers to the homegrown national Anglo-Saxon tradition. Okay, you've been studying Beowulf, I believe, with Madame Edon, and so you will have seen examples of no doubt of Beowulf, what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like, and it's writing which is very heavily stressed. Stress is far more important than syllables. Okay, so with Anglo-Saxon verse, you can have as many syllables as you like. The number of syllables is not important. What is important is the number of stresses. Okay, the number of stresses in the line. That's what the ear is trained to listen for. And the lines are linked, the words in the lines are linked, and the parts of the lines are linked through alliteration. When the first consonant of the word, the stressed syllable of the word, is the same as the first consonant of other words in the line, that's alliteration. Another aspect of Beowulf, of Anglo-Saxon verse, is the formula, the repetition of certain formulas that come back over and over again, such as this: "Weox under Walknum," which means wax under welkin. And then kennings as the other thing. Okay, so alliteration, formulae, and kennings. Kennings are these sort of epithets, ways of referring to everyday objects. The sea, for instance, being described as swans riding. You get them in Homer, you get them in all epic verse, in fact, these formulas that keep coming back. Okay, so stress or accent or strong beat. Okay, those are different ways of referring to them. So Morgane says, "Will I put this on Amétis?" Well, I suppose I could, yeah, if you like. I was just using it as a sort of blackboard, really, for you, but I can put it on Amétis if that's helpful. Certainly, yeah, no problem. I'll tidy it up a bit. We've mentioned, so the iambic pentameter then is part decasyllabic, part stress-based, with 5 strong beats. That's the point. And what you get, in fact, not just in sonnet writing, but in English poetry generally, is sort of moving towards one direction or the other. It's sort of there's either a tension going on between the two traditions, or some poets, and we'll be seeing some instances of this today, sort of hark back to the Anglo-Saxon tradition and want to purify the language and purify the tradition back to the Anglo-Saxon, get rid of all this Latinate stuff, all these Latinisms and this continental influence, and get back to Anglo. And others moved to, are fascinated with the classics, Latin and Greek authors, and with the elegant, courtly Italian and French syllabic verse. Any questions so far? So the hybridity then, a hybrid line. Okay, thank you, Nino and Chloe. Great. So yeah, just to say that there are other poetic traditions in the British Isles. Okay, don't imagine that this is the only one, but it's very much the dominant one. I mean, here I've put the word Singaned, which is that's the wrong pronunciation. I don't know if there's anybody here who knows how to pronounce Welsh properly. But it's a Welsh kind, as a kind of sound patterning that you get in Welsh verse. Okay, there's Gaelic traditions and Celtic poetry, of course, in Wales, Ireland, and so on. The accentual syllabic is the dominant one. Now, writing a sonnet, you will have gathered from everything you've heard about form, is writing a sonnet is a kind of negotiation with form. Okay, it's if you choose to write a sonnet, then you accept this sort of challenge of a particular kind of negotiation with form. But why write a sonnet? And why do contemporary poets continue to find it an interesting form to use, or even an irresistible form to choose? It may be that some poets don't actually choose to write a poem, but as it turns out, they suddenly find themselves writing a sonnet. It's so much part of the tradition that it's almost difficult to avoid, maybe in some cases. So John Fuller, to go back then to this academic from Oxford, who's also a poet, he describes the success of the sonnet in the following terms. If I put that here, he says that the sonnet, above all other lyric forms, with its unique combination of emotional intensity and argued development, gives the reader a powerful sense not only of a mind in communion with itself, but a mind in which thought significantly proceeds to a point of greater understanding. Now, there's quite a lot there. I'm just going to find you the quotation from Coleridge. He quotes Coleridge, who observes that Coleridge, the great English romantic poet, let me just write down his name because you may not be familiar with him, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Okay, so one of our great romantic poets, and he says that a sonnet is a poem in which some lonely feeling is developed. I think it's rather beautiful. Okay, some lonely feeling is developed. Okay, and that's what John Fuller is saying in this quotation. He says it gives the reader a powerful sense of a mind in communion with itself. Okay, a mind in communion with itself. But more than that, he says, it's a mind in which thought significantly proceeds to a point of greater understanding. So there's the idea of not simply sort of a photograph of the inside of your mind, if you like. It's not just thoughts or free association of ideas. It's active thinking. It's moving. It's dynamic. It's development. And when he says it has a unique combination of emotional intensity and argued development. I think that's very, very interesting, succinct summary of what the sort of force of attraction, why the sonnet is such a successful form. It's because it has this emotional intensity. It's a very short, compact form. So, and argued development. Okay. And this idea of taking, moving on, of moving to a newer understanding. That's what it does. So it sort of dramatizes thought. It dramatizes thought. It's through a dualistic kind of structure. Now, any questions so far? Okay, so when we say 20th century, when we think 20th century, we think modernism, postmodernism later on. But first of all, modernism. Now, I haven't got time to give you a whole introduction to modernism, but with modernism, I mean, if you like, the sort of it's complicated because the French tradition and the English tradition, or the Anglo-American tradition, if you like, well, the English tradition and then Anglo-American, I wouldn't say the Anglo-American tradition, the Anglo-American modernism, Anglo-American modernism. They don't coincide. If you like, in France, you have symbolism at the end of the 19th century, which had a great influence on modernism, with people like Mallarmé, Laforgue, and then later on you get surrealism. The real sort of break with the past comes with surrealism in France, I think, whereas in Anglo-American poetry, it's modernism, which began before the First World War, and then, well, yeah, it did before the First World War, and then took on particularly between the two wars. Okay, and was greatly due to Ezra Pound, two American poets, and T.S. Eliot, okay, who both came to Europe. And particularly to England, but and also Italy and France. So with relation to our class on the sonnet, what modernism did was to challenge received forms. Okay, they challenged all received forms, yeah? And they replaced received forms, traditional poetic forms, with free verse, of course, free verse, which as you have here, and other new. Once again, we use the word verse there to refer to a particular prosody, a particular English kind of prosody, and also new ways of shaping language, such as through collage techniques, which obviously comes from the visual arts, placing fragments of verse, of poetry, and juxtaposing them. They used musical forms, they used mythical structures, they used parataxis, which is the idea of juxtaposition of fragments. Okay, so they challenged traditional forms, all traditional forms. And so that in itself would be a reason for not using the sonnet in the 20th century. And indeed, not many modernists, followers of Ezra Pound certainly, not many sonnets were written, but some were. And the sonnet form has taken on more importance as the century has gone on. So there's other reasons for not writing the sonnet. Well, the sonnet, as we said, relies on argued development. Now, argued development means sequence, things in sequence, thoughts in sequence. It means a succession and a sort of temporal unfolding. Whereas modernist poetry, as we've seen with collage technique, often sought spatial forms. It was more interested in spatializing form rather than, sequence. Modernism sought to sort of counteract the flow of English poetry, to counteract the flow of time, the flow of language, the flow of time, to sort of slow it down or put it on hold. Now, this is also, one might say, a characteristic of the sonnet. Has also been described as a monument. I don't know whether you studied John Donne's The Canonization, which reads as follows: "We'll build in sonnets pretty rooms, as well a well-wrought urn becomes the greatest ashes as half-acre tombs. And by these hymns all shall approve us canonized for love." Okay, that's John Donne, a metaphysical poet, and from the 17th century. And so you've got there the idea of sort of fixing time in the idea of a sonnet as a monument to love. Okay, a monument to love in this poem. So there is that idea also, but nevertheless, most modernists began at least by rejecting the sonnet. John Fuller considers, oh, hang on, there's a question here from the poem by John Donne. Yeah, it's called The Canonization. Where am I? It's stanza 4. Okay, the line that's okay. There's in this stanza. There's a very, very famous line. Okay, which is this one: "Well wrought urn," and it's very famous. An urn is for a funeral urn, right? For ashes. Huh? And so it's the idea of the poem as a monument to death, and a well-wrought urn is the name of a very famous work of criticism. Book by Clent Brooks in the 20th century, a work of new criticism. The idea of a poem as a sort of closed off structural entity. So John Fuller, who's a great fan of sonnets, regrets that some of the modernists didn't write sonnets, and other poets didn't write sonnets, and he quite amusingly says that the Bronte sisters, for instance, and the American modernist poet Wallace Stevens, who you've got here, Wallace Stevens, says that he should have been a sonneteer. He was the kind of poet who should have written sonnets but didn't. They probably didn't because of this feeling that, you know, that it was an outmoded, old-fashioned form that was no longer of any you know, use to modern poetry. So there is that that feeling that sonnets are obviously, you know, for the past, and they're not appropriate to modern poetry. This is a subject that is tackled by Carol Birken Bertz, okay, who's a colleague. She teaches in Paris, and she has written an article which I don't know if you received the message, the annonce message from the Amethyst page that I sent earlier on a couple of hours ago. Well, I've sent you a link to an article by her on the contemporary English sonnet. So I do recommend that. It's called Mapping the Contemporary Sonnet in Mainstream and Linguistically Innovative Late 20th and Early 21st Century British Poetry. Okay, so it's on our subject. And she distinguishes, as you can see from that title that I just read, between mainstream and linguistically innovative poets. Okay, she calls them MS and LI poets, okay? Mainstream and linguistically innovative. And she makes the point that there's this problem with sequence, with succession of, you know, of ideas that I was referring to. And that another reason, or a related reason for not writing poets in the sonnets in the 20th century, if you are a modernist or a postmodernist, if you're a linguistically innovative poet, perhaps I should just say a word about mainstream and linguistically innovative. Does anybody know what is meant by mainstream in English poetry? Have you come across that before? No? Well, just to say first that poetry is probably, okay, poetry is probably more widely read in the English-speaking world than it is in the French-speaking world, at least in France, first of all. And secondly, that poetry over the 20th century has sort of divided itself into these two groups. And one way of distinguishing them is between those poets who are published by well-established publishing houses, and those who are published by small, you know, independent publishers. So on the one hand, you've got the idea of poetry which is more accessible to the everyday reader, to the ordinary reading public, and on the other hand, poetry which is experimental and experimenting with language and questioning everything related to what poetry is, what literature is. So we'll be mostly looking at mainstream poets, but it's interesting to you know, to bear in mind this distinction if you start to, you know, take an interest in English poetry. So Carole Berkenberst says that what's one of the other reasons for not writing sonnets when you're a linguistically innovative poet is that the lyrical I has been, the very existence of the lyrical I that I've written down here, look, has been challenged by modern society, by consumerism, by the commodification society, by alienation of various kinds, as well as by linguistic and psychoanalytical theory, changing philosophical notions of subjectivity. If the subject is perceived not as speaking language, but as being spoken by it, you see the reversal there, rather than being the source, the origin of what I say, that words are, as it were, flowing through me. They are words that I am just sort of picking up and that are out there, and that I am using, and that they are therefore speaking me rather than me speaking them. Then this, if that's the idea that we have about subjectivity, that it's more objective than subjective, okay, then the sonnet, which supposes the existence of a unified, centralized speaking subject whose thoughts are conveyed through language, I'm using language to convey my thoughts. If the sonnet is congenial to that, then it would seem an outmoded form and inappropriate. That you can't have a development of thought if you don't, if you sort of challenge the idea that there is a subject in the first place, a lyrical I. So the same goes with its formal characteristics. The pentameter and the rhyme scheme seem too closely related to this outmoded approach to language. Linguistically innovative poets are looking for new materials for poetry. Often they'll be lifting texts from everyday contexts, whether it be sales jargon, advertising, academic texts, they'll be mixing registers in a manner similar to the surrealists, okay, with their objets trouvés, found objects. So you can see that that's a very different frame of reference, a different sort of poetic atmosphere to be working in than that of the sonnet, which is, as we saw, the sonnet is a mind in communion with itself. So some contemporary poets have therefore developed the notion of the sonnet not as a form, a received form, a fixed form, but as a process into which perhaps the poem will naturally fall. Okay, so that might be interesting. That's an interesting, I think, concept to have in mind when writing about these 20th and 21st century poets, how they are perhaps more process, something unfolding, than fixed form. Two last points. That I've finished with my introduction. Despite the many reasons for not writing sonnets today, sonneteers are nevertheless to be found among mainstream and linguistically innovative poets. Both groups, both mainstream and linguistically innovative poets, reinvent and revitalize the form, continue to do so. So that's the first point. And secondly, we should bear in mind, as John Fuller points out, that despite its stability, the sonnet has always been an object of formal and thematic innovation. Okay, he writes, when the sonnet arrived in the Tudor court in the Renaissance, about 3 centuries after its invention in Italy, it was already freighted, that is to say, weighed down, with the Petrarchan idealism, which the Elizabethans went on to celebrate and ironize. So when the Elizabethans took on the Petrarchan sonnet, they continued, if you like, in the same vein, of the same idealistic vein, love poetry, celebratory love poetry, but they also began to ironize. They also ironized. They were also using irony, and they, mocking it, if you like, parodying from the outset. So while the primary function and on the where themes, where content is concerned, it's not just the form, but the primary function of the sonnet was erotic and religious devotion. He said it's, although that's the core, if you like, the core themes, the sonnet has from the beginning branched out into politics, for instance, with Milton in the 17th century, into domestic issues, into visionary and nature poetry with the Romantics, and so on. Okay, so it's what I'm saying is that the sonnet seems to have a very strong attraction for English poets, and that even when they don't want to write in poetic form at all, they end up sometimes using it, and that actually from the outset, from the very beginning, it's always been an innovative form. So to give an example of this sort of liveliness of the sonnet and of its innovation, I've put here for you a poem by William Barnes, whose dates you can see there, 1801 to 1886. And I'm just going to try and read this poem to you as best I can. It's called False Friends Like. When I were still a boy and mother's pride, a bigger boy spoke up to me so kind-like. If you do like, I'll treat ye wi' a ride in there's wheelbarrow here. Though I were blind-like to what he had a working in his mind-like, and mounted for a passenger inside. And coming to a puddle, purty wide, he tipped me in, a grinning back behind like. Though when a man do come to me so thick like, and shake me hand, where once he passed me by, and tell me he would do me this or that, I can't help thinking of the big boy's trick like. And then, for all I can but wag my hat and thanken, I do feel a little shy. Now, I don't know how easy that is for you to follow in this Dorset dialect. Dorset is a county in the southwest of England, where there's quite a strong rural, it's a very rural county, and this is a very strong rural accent. What this tells the story of a childhood anecdote when he was a child and a big boy offered to take him for a ride in a wheelbarrow with a big smile on his face. And the little boy was obviously very pleased and got into the wheelbarrow, said in brouette, and was pushed along by the big boy. And then then there was a puddle, and the big boy tipped him into the puddle. So he derives from that anecdote a sort of moral. It's a sort of moral tale, and he says that as an adult, he's no longer so innocent, and he is always a bit suspicious when somebody who used to ignore him, where once he passed me by, someone who used to ignore him suddenly starts being very nice and friendly, and so he's learned to be a bit less naive, a bit more suspicious. I do feel a little shy. I think he means shy doesn't mean sort of timid in the usual sense, but it means a little suspicious. So as a sonnet, what kind of sonnet would you say it is? Petrarchan or Shakespearean?
I'm not sure, but maybe more Shakespearean, because it seems, it looks like there is a couplet in the end that kind of looks like the moral. So maybe more of a Shakespearean.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It's not a strict Shakespearean sonnet, there's no couplet at the end. Hat rhymes with that, and shy does not rhyme. But you've basically got a four. You've got three quatrains, with pride rhyming with ride, like, kind like, blind like. So A B, and then mind like, that is mind like, inside, wide, behind like. So then you've got, B A B, and then B again, and then A, and then C, and then B, and then C, and then whatever it was. I've got lost there, but yeah, you see what I mean. It's not a strict rhyme scheme, Shakespearean rhyme scheme, but it has that couplet at the end, and it's got four quatrains. And just notice the rhyme on like. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because in contemporary English, it's terrible, this word like, which gets used all the time, and it comes from American, but it's also there in English dialect, 19th century English dialect, this like all the time. And notice that the like forms what we call a feminine rhyme, or an unstressed rhyme, because the stress falls on kind like, blind like, behind like, mind like. Okay, so that's something to notice, which is unusual. And so yes, more or less, it's a Shakespearean sonnet, although it sort of hovers between the two. You might think the subject matter and the register are rural, in contrast with the Elizabethan sonnet. That's interesting too, isn't it? It's a rural setting, the wheelbarrow, the puddle, the mud. And it's and then the language, the dialect, of course, is rural, and this contrasts with the courtly tradition of the Elizabethan sonnet. However, the poem is a moral tale, as we said. It's sort of moral meditation with a lesson, a childhood anecdote used to illustrate, growth, the sort of development from innocence to experience that we get in Blake, don't we? Poems of innocence and poems of experience. This development from innocence to experience, in the sort of illustration of hypocrisy, and so it's a moral tale in the tradition of Aesop's fables and La Fontaine. The expression "a wolf in sheep's clothing." So an example then of innovation in the sonnet in the 19th century. Now, this poem is also a good introduction to the first poem that I want to look at today, poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins that I asked you to prepare. Gerard Manley Hopkins, whose dates are 1844 to 1889, and who, like Barnes, was also a man of the church, okay? In his case, a Jesuit priest. Now, both these poets were interested in Old English, what I've been saying about the homegrown tradition. They were interested in purifying the Anglo-Saxon strain of English in poetry. And Hopkins developed what he called a sprung rhythm. Okay, sprung rhythm. This is down here, look. And sprung rhythm was to the purpose of it was to go against what he called running rhythm, which is what we've been describing, the dominant accentual syllabic English poetic line, okay, which is basically distinguished by the alternate stressed and unstressed syllables, da 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 da. Okay, the English prosody is built upon this this contrast between stressed and unstressed syllables. And so he said, for Hopkins, this was too same and tame. Tame, ça veut dire apprivoisé, and same, to this, always the same sound, too boring. So he developed his sprung rhythm, which was, once again, any number of a variable number of syllables. So it could, if you like, a foot with a variable number of syllables, 2, 3, 4, with the stress always falling on the first syllable. Okay, so he saw it as a way to escape the constraints of running rhythm. And it can be seen as, and the reason okay, you might ask why I want you to read a 19th century poem. Well, Hopkins, he had, his poetry was sort of rediscovered in the 20th century, and it had a very strong influence on a number of 20th century poets. So that's why I want you to read this poem. Now there are, okay, we'll perhaps come back to that in a sec, but these notions in scape and in stress are important for understanding Hopkins's poetry, in scape and in stress. But let's just have a look at the poem, and perhaps we'll mention that as we go along. So can you all turn to your plaquette, and or do you want me to? I could do it here, I suppose. I stop that, and here we are, the plaquette. Okay, pied beauty then. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple colour as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire coal, chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted and pieced, fold, fallow and plough, and all trades, their gear and tackle and trim. All things counter, original, spare, strange. Whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle, dim. He fathers forth whose beauty is past change. Praise him. Now, I said Gerard Manley Hopkins was a Jesuit priest, and he was torn throughout his life between his religious calling and his poetic vocation, and his compulsion to write poetry to celebrate nature, to celebrate the beauty of nature. And it was very, very complicated. Had a very difficult life and a rather short life, torn between these two, what he sometimes felt to be contradictory drives, desires. So what he's doing here is reconciling those two tendencies, celebrating nature, beauty of the world, which of course he felt to be it's a conflict between aesthetics and ascetics, if you like. He was an ascetic who felt he had to renounce the appeal to the senses, and yet you can see from this poem how very strongly he responded to the beauty of nature. So anyway, it's framed as a religious poem, this one. And this the well, perhaps rather than me just talking you through it, would somebody like to say what they have understood of this poem?
Can you hear me?
Thank you, Nino.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So first of all, I found it a bit difficult because I didn't know most of the vocabulary, maybe not most, but a lot of vocabulary. So I had to check it out a lot. And it was mainly about, well, the colors and the idea that there are different kind of colors and all this vocabulary of stains or stripes or things like that, which are at the core of the poem, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. Yes, I'll just interrupt you a sec.
Sure.
The word pied, and which means two colors or three, a mixture of black and white usually, pied, dappled, which means multicolored, patches of different colors, brinded, the same, and stipple. All these words refer to multicolored things in the natural world. Yes, go on.
So I found maybe two main how could I say ideas throughout the poem. So the first was the most obvious one, which was some kind, well, just like you said, the celebration of nature and maybe of things that are not immaculate in a way because of all these stains and these stripes, and so things that are not perfect and yet they are amazing to him. And also my first reaction actually when I read pied, because I didn't know the word, it made me think of pied in French, and it made me think of, well, poetry actually, like a foot. And so it led me to trying to find if we could read that as a celebration of poetry. And I thought that maybe it is actually, because with all of this idea of black strained and black stripes, maybe it could refer to the words and the lines of poetry on the page, on a white page, for instance. And also there is at some point there is an image about the fields and the plow, sorry, and it's part of the poetic tradition to compare a poetic line to the plowed field.
The furrow.
So, yeah,
the furrow.
Yeah, that's it, definitely. So yeah, that's what I found about it.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Dinon. You said an awful lot. Yes. Just to say that actually there are critics who say that all good poetry is also about poetry. So there's all and certainly with 20th and 21st century sonnets, they are often meta sonnets. They are often sonnets about writing sonnets, as well as being sonnets in their own right, sort of thing. So that's a very interesting point. And I love the way you go through the French pied to the English foot, and that way into a reading of the poem as a poem about poetry. Yeah, good. Anybody else want to add anything? What about the sound, the prosody, the...
Yes, I found it interesting, not especially about the prosody, but the fact that he wants to celebrate nature, but he really limit himself with two colors or this pied beauty. He could have talked about rainbows or anything, but I can sense this the framing of the poetry also in the subjects, the objects he places in the poetry, his poem. And yes, then the consonant cluster with swift, slow, sweet, sour. It's
Yes, that's alliteration, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
He makes tremendous use of alliteration in the poem. You've got glory to God, couple colour, cow, fresh fire coal, falls, plotted pieced, fold, fallow, and so on. His that is reminiscent, isn't it, of the Anglo-Saxon tradition that we get in Beowulf, organizing the line, making the lines sort of emphasizing the unit of the line through alliteration, father's forth, and so on and so forth. Yes, and what you said about the sort of the nature of the individual nature of each thing. That's what this poem. It's celebrating dappled things in their intrinsic individuality. That's what inscape, that term inscape, is. Okay, it's just give you a definition. It's it's the idea of the individual. What he's interested in is the individuality and uniqueness of each thing. Okay, the sort of intrinsic beauty of things, the individual self, the expression of the inner core of individuality. That's what inscape is, and in stress is the way is the apprehension of an object. The in stress is the poetry, if you like, the apprehension of an object in an intense thrust of energy. So those two, inscape and in stress, work together to produce the poem. In terms of a sonnet, then, what kind of sonnet? Is it a sonnet? Does it have the requirements of a sonnet, the formal requirements of a sonnet?
I'd say that it kind of begins all right with a sestet with ABC, ABC, but then it gets a little more strange and it goes to DBC, DC. So it's a bit more mixed at the end, especially because the last one is only 5 lines, and it almost sounds like this praise him is alone, even though it rhymes with dim and swim and things like that. But it arrives a bit, because it's very short also, so it seems a bit unique in its way.
Yes. What kind of sonnet is it? Is it more a Petrarchan or more a Shakespearean sonnet?
Well, things there's a sestet, maybe more of a Petrarchan, I'd say.
More a Petrarchan sonnet, isn't it? But it does hesitate between the two. It's got 11 lines or 10 and a half lines, not 14. So strictly speaking, it's not a traditional sonnet. But if we, what does it have in common with the sonnet? And why could we consider it as a sonnet, do you think? And in what sense might it be said to be related to the Shakespearean sonnet? Anybody like to? I mean, how can you tell? Well, Ninon says this, you've got this sort of this sestet at the beginning when usually we expect an octave, and then these 4.5 lines here. But usually you've basically nonetheless got a structure in 2 parts, haven't you? So you usually expect a sort of change of a volta, the change of direction comes at the beginning of the second part and the sestet. Where would you put the volta? Where is there a change, do you think, in this change of direction? Well, I suppose it's perhaps not that easy to determine, but isn't there a sort of an effect of a couplet at the end with he fathers forth whose beauty is past change, praise him, whereas up until now, even though there's a change of stanza, the poem has been focusing on the things of the natural world. It's been focusing on nature, on creation, if you like, God's creation, and then in the last 2 lines, it changes focus to attend to the divine, to God. He fathers forth whose beauty. And there's a change there also from, if you think about all the images that he's given of dappled things and couple color, bring it, there's this this sort of image of things that are sort of flickering in the light, and they're changing. And you've got this word fickle, which means changing, changeable, changing. And swift, slow, sweet, sour, of these switching from one to the other, from one, this contrast, like the play of light, and the play of light and shadow. Okay, things that are in, ephemeral, that are part of this world of flux and change. And then in the last two lines, you've got this idea of sort of transcendent immobility of something which does not change and flicker. So there's a sort of Shakespearean feel to that, I would say. That those last two lines, which feel a bit like a Shakespearean couplet at the end, this sort of change of direction. Okay, so it's I would argue that it's part Petrarchan and part Shakespearean. Okay, Hopkins himself considered this poem as a sonnet. Okay, it's actually he claimed it's been shrunk proportionally, mathematically. Okay, the octave has become a sestet, and the sestet has become a quatrain. Okay, from 8 to 6 and from 6 to 4, and there's a sort of an additional, what he calls tail piece added on. So that ends up with 10 and a half lines. And he calls it a curtal sonnet. A curtal sonnet. I can't write now because I've got the poem here, but it's a curtal sonnet, Curtal. He wrote 3 such sonnets. So he considers this to be a sonnet. We haven't said anything about the meter. Would anybody like to comment on the meter? Remember, one of the main characteristics of the traditional sonnet is the iambic pentameter. So does this line comply to that rule of the iambic pentameter? Anybody like to discuss that? Anybody notice anything about the meter here, the prosody? Maybe someone's, I haven't got the, okay, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see so Oceane has said it's quite irregular. Yes. Actually, I think I should be able to get the chat at the same time. Let me try again. Yes, there, I've got it. Yes, it is irregular. Can you say, Oceane, can you give us a bit more detail? Okay, it doesn't belong. Is it, first of all, does it use iambic pentameters?
So I tried to count the meters. So, for instance, on line 1, glory be to God for dappled things. And then 4 skies.
So how would you, okay, just how would you, what that first line, what is that first line in terms of English meter? English prosody. How would you describe it? It's not a pentameter. So what is it?
I don't know the word for 9.
but you're thinking in terms of syllables. Actually, what am I talking about? It has got 5 beats, hasn't it? I don't know why I'm thinking it's only got 4, but it hasn't. It's got 5. Glory be to God for dappled things. It's simply a trochaic pentameter. It's a pentameter. It has 9 syllables, and we said that pentameters sometimes do, but it begins with a trochaic. Glory be to God for dappled. It's using. Okay, I'll use the chat myself here now. Falling rhythm. All right. When instead rising rhythm is iambic, and falling rhythm is trochaic. It begins with a strong beat. Glory be to God for dappled things. Mm-hmm. And then we move to an iambic line, don't we, for skies, because that begins with an unstressed, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow. Yeah, do you want to go on, Oceane? What else did you notice?
For now, I think it's the only thing that I've noticed.
Okay, so it's definitely not doing the usual. It's definitely not complying to the dominant accentual syllabic line, which goes da 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 da, etc. Not tetrameters or pentameters. It seems to be sort of slowing down the rhythm, doesn't it, with this trochaic beginning. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow, and all these consonantal clusters which make it difficult, as I think was it Narmeen was saying, that make it difficult to pronounce for and then the assonance as well. It's very ostentatious assonance and alliteration for rose, moles, all. Now here we have 3 strong syllables, the same as all trades. Okay, you've got instead of the alternating stressed and unstressed, you've got 2 or 3 strong stresses. So a spondy there for rose, that would be an iamb, and then moles all a spondy, which is a foot with 2 strong stresses. For rose, moles all in stipple upon trout that swim. Fresh fire coal, chestnut falls. There you've got fresh fire, beginning with the spondy there. And then chestnut falls. You've got, they're very rich words, even though that you can, there's an, the alternation is respected. There's nevertheless, the words are very strong, very, very rich in meaning. Fire, coal, chestnut, falls. It's tempting to stress them all. Finch's wings and so on. And all the lines are end stopped as well, are they not? We end with a strong beat, things, cow, swim, wings, plow, trim, strange. And they are all strong beats, and they are all single syllable, they're monosyllabics. Monosyllabics. As opposed to the polysyllabic, more Latinate words, okay? In the Anglo-Saxon word tradition tends to produce a lot of strong syllabled monosyllabics, and this is what we find at the ends of the lines here. End stopped. End stopped is a word meaning, does anybody know the meaning of end stopped? End stopped lines as opposed to run on lines. Okay, this is a bit of terminology for you. End stopped lines are lines like these here, which end, where the end of the line corresponds to a syntactical break. okay, as opposed to a run-on line or an enjambement. Okay, all these lines are end stopped, all of them. Okay, there's colons or semicolons or brackets or full stops, they're all end stopped. And they're even more emphatic because they end with strong syllable monosyllabics. Okay. So he's using this, all these effects, the sound patterning, the rich alliterative patterning, and the strong use of strong beats helps, and of spondees, successions of strong beats, helps to slow down the line and to counteract, as it were, what Ezra Pound calls the heave of the pentameter. Okay. Ezra Pound, the modernist poet I was referring to. Okay, this is why Hopkins was so popular with modernist poets, because not because of his religious inspiration, but because of his work on the strong accents of dialect and his attempt to slow down, to counter the running rhythm of the iambic pentameter, the natural flow of the language. Okay. And one other thing, did you notice the way the left hand side of the poem is irregular too? There's this sort of falling pattern here in the left hand side, with the lines being indented, increasingly indented. What might that, how can you interpret that? Because when you describe things, you also need to interpret. Ask yourselves, it's when you're writing on poetry or on literature generally, it's always it's important to pay close attention to the text and be able to describe what's going on and name what's happening, but also to say why, to interpret. Ask yourselves always, so what? Et alors? So how can you interpret that this sort of falling rhythm on the left hand side of the poem? Any suggestions? Well, it's yeah, anybody? Perhaps not easy to say. And I don't know any more than you, but there's this idea in Hopkins of the energy in things, and that the sort of dynamic force in the natural objects that he focuses on. So maybe that's a way, rather than the sort of static effect of the line, having one line under another, perhaps this is a way of introducing process, dynamism into the poem, making it less of a fixed monument and more something that is alive, that corresponds to the dynamism of the inscape, of the individuality of the things that he's representing.
Maybe by what you just said, maybe he kind of create a structure in the first stanza, because the rhymes are how do you say, they're not correct, but they work, and also because the indentation is quite repetitive, but then everything is destroyed, I would say, in the last stanza. So as if he wanted to show us a structure, to just break everything at the end, to show that it's better to break things up, maybe.
what setting up something beautiful and then breaking it, do you mean?
Maybe not beautiful, but a structure, and then to show that it's maybe even more beautiful, to destroy the structure and to have something more free, maybe.
Yes. Yeah, maybe. Why not? He's certainly showing that he can reinvent that structure, can appropriate it and adapt it to, and sort of propose a new approach. That's and I mean he's it's as if, it seems to me that it is as if he was saying that, you know, the sonnet. If you take it as a sonnet about, as a meta sonnet, a sonnet about sonnets, it's as if he was saying that the sonnet does not belong to like the world of literature. That it doesn't belong to polite society. It belongs to the world of changing things, of fickle things, of flux, and that words are like not arbitrary conventions, but, you know, anchored in specific individual realities. It seems to me that that's what he's sort of saying there, that he's trying to show that it's it's not the sonnet is not the property of official literature. Yeah. Okay. So I think that'll probably do for today, unless there are any more comments or questions that you'd like to make before we part. No? Okay, does that sort of make sense? Do you feel, I hope you feel better, you know, armed, equipped to go on and read sonnets, the sonnets in the booklet, but also other sonnets, and, you know, to see what, you know, what they're doing with the sonnet, how the sonnet is being constantly reinvented and adapted to different people's concerns and interrogations. Okay, so thank you for your attention, and have a look on the Amethyst page. There's the preface to John Fuller, and there'll be hopefully a list of poems there, more poems for you to read, more sonnets for you to read. Okay, thanks very much. See you next week. Bye-bye.